Okay, y'all, it's about 5 after, so we're going to get started. Thank you all so much for being here. This is our 7th annual summit, so we're really proud of that. This summit is presented by us, the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance, as well as the Hudson River Watershed Alliance. We really want to thank them for their support. They are hosting us on Zoom, and they have also provided their Zoom services in the past year in this ongoing pandemic. So that's been really crucial to us being able to keep our mission going during this difficult time. My name is Kyle Sitzman. I'm the chair of the board of the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance, and I'll be giving everyone a summary of the last year since our last summit. And with us today, we have Audrey and Wayne, and they're going to be presenting a Wallkill River fish tissue study. If you're not already registered, tomorrow is part 2 of this summit. We'll have Rob Ferry, our treasurer, present his MS4 training program, as well as Brian Duffy and Meredith Streeter on Wallkill River water quality monitoring. Happy birthday to the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance. This image you see here is from the first summit that was held 6 years ago. Concerned citizens held this summit, and it was the impetus for this founding of the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance. So 6 years and still going really strong, and we have a lot to be proud of. Once the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance was founded, they established the mission that you can see here. I really believe in this mission, especially this last part, to act as the voice and to advocate for the restoration of the entire watershed. So we really try and take that watershed approach when working towards improving the Wallkill River. So over the past year, we have this is our first year as a 501c3, so an official non-for-profit. For those of you who don't know, that 501c3 status allows for us to apply for grants. Donations to the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance are then deductible on your taxes. This gives us perpetual existence. So even if I'm no longer here, or some of our board members are no longer here, the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance can carry on its mission. And then there's obviously the main component being that public perception of legitimacy. In this past year, we've been 100% volunteer run. So that's a lot of credit goes to all of our board members and people who have participated in our events that really allow this group to thrive. One of our events this year is the annual sweep put together by Riverkeeper in the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance. There were 4 sites. Just in our little site here from this image in Sojourner Truth Park in New Paltz, we got about 400 pounds of trash. So that's always really great to see that we can help to clean up the litter that's in the Wallkill River. We have our ongoing sampling that happens in the Wallkill River. For those looking to get more involved, we have these links you can follow here, and these slides will be sent out afterward, but that lead to forms that you can fill out if you're out on the water and you see something. Follow these forms where you can report anything, any issues that you see along the water. So we really appreciate our boat brigade and other people that are out on the water that let us know when there's any issues going on. Another thing we do is the Adopt a Highway program. So look out for our sign if you're on Route 208. Our stretch of road is in between Dressel Farms and the Plattekill Brook, just south of the village of New Paltz. You can see that stretch of road is right along here, if you can see my map. So this is really important because this prevents trash from ending up in the Wallkill. There's the small tributary here that leads right into the Wallkill River. So that's a really great event for us, and has some really scenic views of the gunks. So that's always a fun event. We do that twice a year in order to keep our sign, the Wallkill River sign that you saw a couple slides ago. We have to go out twice a year, so we usually get about anywhere between 5 and 10 volunteers. So if you're interested, keep an eye out for that. We have 2 events coming up this summer. Another really great program is the Trees for Trips program. So this is from the DEC. This year we had about 100 trees planted at the OSI River to Ridge trailhead in New Paltz, right around here. This is a really great program and decreases erosion, reduces flood damage, improves wildlife and stream habitat, and also protects water quality. This is especially important across an agricultural site. Another important component of any watershed group is our educational component. So y'all are here for this summit, but also our the MS4 trainings that Rob does, and that you all will be hearing more about tomorrow. Advocacy. So this year we weren't able to have our elected official roundtable that we've had in previous years, but we have advocated for certain projects to be halted, such as the drag strip that's proposed up in Modena. We were featured in the Orange County Climate Report, which was really great to see. Some of the work that we've done was highlighted in their report, especially in terms of the HABs monitoring. We did a letter writing campaign for the Town of Montgomery Comprehensive Plan. For those of you that aren't familiar, the Town of Montgomery is under a lot of developmental pressure, especially with large warehouses, and the Amazon warehouse that's been built there. So we wrote a lengthy letter urging the Town of Montgomery to consider the Wallkill River and its tributaries, especially as it relates to this developmental pressure. And then we've also written letters of support for the Wallkill Watershed Farm Runoff Control Project to reduce the impact of agriculture on especially nutrient loads on the Wallkill River. And if anyone hears about and is concerned about development in the watershed, please let us know. We are always willing to write letters of support to keep an eye on these potentially harmful projects going on in the watershed. And we're really excited that we've been working on, Rob and I especially have been working on an Adopt a Boat Launch program. So this program the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance will facilitate community groups and businesses to adopt a boat launch on the Wallkill River. So we will help to match these community groups and businesses with landowners, whether it be public or private land along the Wallkill River, to improve the boat launches. And the goal of this adoption will be to improve access, whether that's upgrading the parking lot or actual access down into the water, perhaps some plantings and green infrastructure, make them more appealing, and add some educational signage. So we're really excited about this program. We are in the process of hiring our first intern since not having any paid employees. This intern will be a landscape architecture student. I myself am a landscape architectural designer, so I will be overseeing this intern and helping them along with creating some of these designs for the Adopt a Boat Launch program, along with Robin. So we're really excited to get this program off the ground, and we have already gotten some interest from people looking to adopt, as well as some of the property owners to some of the boat launches. So looking forward to see how this plays out. I really think that access to the water is really important, and to get people to care about it, really. So as the organization grows, this will be a great way to continue to grow our organization. And thank you. Any questions? All right. Okay, then we can hand it over to Wayne then.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, so I'm going to share screen and let's try that. So are you seeing first slide? Okay, so here we go. Well, good evening. Thanks for coming out to listen. And we're going to talk about the fish contaminant results that we got from the Wallkill River in 2017. And my part of this is to just give you the results, and Audrey Van Gnechten from the Health Department is going to talk about what those results mean for eating fish. So I'll start by giving you some background on DEC's fish contaminant monitoring program. Let's see, hang on, let's get this going. There we go. Okay. So to do that, we need to first talk about why we monitor fish for contaminants. And we do this for a variety of reasons. The first important thing to think about is that fish are really good environmental integrators. A lot of contaminants get into the water, they're carried by the water, they get into our rivers and lakes, and there they get taken up by the fish. A lot of contaminants bioaccumulate, which means they end up in the fish at concentrations that are considerably higher than what's in the water. So and the other part about this is that the fish integrate over time. So if you just take a water quality sample, it's a snapshot, but the fish tend to kind of even out short-term changes. And so they're kind of like these little environmental sensors for us. And we can use this for a variety of things. One really important aspect is for health advisories. So fish sometimes do accumulate contaminants at concentrations that are not so good to eat. And so the health department will issue advisories to either limit or not to eat at all. Beyond that, fish can really tell us about the status of contaminants in the environment. We can see old problems, we can see what's going on with them, and we can find new possibilities, contaminants that we're newly aware about or more recently introduced into the environment, find out if they're accumulating. And we can look at change over time. We can see if there's improvement, and we tend to see that with things like PCBs, or maybe there's not, like we don't tend to see a lot of improvement with mercury. We can also find problem areas. So if we find really high concentrations in the fish, that might point us to, we've got to see if there's a source that we can do something about. And finally, we can evaluate remediation. Did we do a good job of cleaning up in the way that it counts, which is what's the availability to the biological world? So with that said, I'd like to give you some background on our fish contaminant monitoring program in New York. New York's been analyzing fish for contaminants for over half a century. We actually began with mercury in 1969, and we started doing organochlorine pesticides and then PCBs in the 1970s. And so we now look at a pretty good group of contaminants, and I'll come back to these in a minute. Most of our analyses are on what we call standard fillet, which is a standard cut that was developed in the early 1980s to be very reproducible, and it's the edible portion of the fish. We do some whole fish analysis as well, though that's mainly on smaller fish. So here's the scope of our program. Sorry. We have a lot of water in New York. We are a pretty water-rich state, and we collect and analyze about 1,500 fish samples per year from around the state. Most of these are analyzed at our Hale Creek Analytical Laboratory in Gloversville, where we do all kinds of analyses. And so we do, on the left side is what we do there. We have mercury, polychlorinated biphenyls, organochlorine pesticides, and per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And we're going to have metals soon. We got a metals analyzer, and they're developing the methods for that. We also contract out some analyses either because we don't have the capacity to handle the volume, or we don't have the capability of doing that. So we contract out some PCB analysis, We contract out per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. We contract out dioxins and furans and polybrominated diphenyl ethers. And I'm just going to spare you the rest of this alphabet soup. So let's move on to the Wallkill River. So in 2017, DEC Fisheries at the New Paltz office collected fish from the mini sink area right in Wallkill River, right over the state line. This is the Wallkill River, which I'm sure most of you know better than I do, running into the Rondout Creek and then into the Hudson River. And they collected at New Paltz. At mini sink, in mini sink, they collected 10 carp. And at New Paltz, they collected 10 channel catfish, 10 smallmouth bass, and 8 walleye. So our laboratory analyzed these for mercury, PCBs, and a whole bunch of organochlorine pesticides. The pesticides included DDT and its metabolites and several chlordanes, which we detected. And I'll just read you the whole list of stuff we didn't detect, and we'll be done with those. So there were heptachlors, aldrin, Myrex and photomyrex, hexachlorocyclohexane, and hexachlorobenzene. So what did we find? So we'll start, this is the first of 4 graphs showing what we found for those things that contaminants that we did detect. So here's mercury. And just to read these graphs, we have the concentration on the y-axis in parts per million. We have the length of the fish on the x-axis in inches. The left panel is at mini sink. The right panel is at New Paltz. Each dot represents the concentration of an individual fish, and the fish are color-coded by species. So we have the carp in red, we have the channel catfish in this sort of dull green, smallmouth bass in turquoise, and the walleye in kind of a violet. And if you need a refresher on that, that's in the legend right there. So what we found for carp at the state line were really quite low at mercury, the higher concentrations in the channel catfish, and then the smallmouth bass, and then the walleye. Now, I think in this case, these differences are largely due to intrinsic differences among these species, because these are typical of the differences that we tend to see in these species for mercury. Mercury tends to biomagnify, become more concentrated as we go up the food chain. So mercury differences are largely reflect food chain position. If we look now at PCBs, we see a somewhat different pattern, and I think a very different interpretation. Carp at the state line are lower than either the channel catfish or the walleye, and I'd say that tends to be unusual. Carp, because they have a high fat content, tend to be among the highest concentrations for PCBs of any species. And so what I think we're seeing here is quite possibly an effect of something coming into the river, a difference in the environment. Now the smallmouth bass here were all but one of them was non-detect. And the other thing I'll say about these is these concentrations are still relatively low for New York State in general. So we had a similar pattern for DDT. This is the total DDT. And that kind of makes sense because DDT and other pesticides that we analyze for are fat soluble like PCBs. So these all tend to be pretty correlated. One difference between the PCBs is that the concentrations we're seeing at New Paltz tend to be a little bit higher than what we're seeing generally around the state for DDT. And we see, again, a very similar pattern for total Chlordane. And again, these are a little bit higher than what we see in most places in New York. I'd like to do a little bit of historical comparison. The one place we can do that is for our 3 species at New Paltz. So what we're looking at here, we'll see 4 of these graphs. Again, mercury concentration on the y-axis in part per million. We have in the left panel channel catfish, the middle panel smallmouth bass, the right panel walleye, and again we have the length of the fish in inches, and each dot represents a fish. The color coding now is the year. So our recent sampling, blue is 2017, we have green 2008, and for the other contaminants, we have red 1997. But we'll get to that in a minute. So for mercury, other than we had some high concentration walleye values, but otherwise really quite similar between 2008 and 2017. For PCBs, we have a little bit of a difference. So we tended to see higher concentrations in the smallmouth bass, are definitely higher, definitely lower. And otherwise pretty similar in the channel catfish and the walleye between the two sampling years. So for Chlordane, we had higher concentrations in the channel catfish here back in 2008. I'm sorry, for DDT. We had higher concentrations in the channel catfish for 2008, that we tend not to see these higher concentrations in 2017. Smallmouth bass, the blue again, were generally lower and really didn't see much of a change in the walleye. And Chlordane was really a very similar pattern. So to sum this all up, we see some indication of a small improvement in the pesticides, a little bit of increase in the walleye, PCBs, and mercury. And for some broader context, I'll give you a very rough comparison with statewide averages. The carp at the state line were about half or less of the statewide average for all four of these contaminants. For PCBs and mercury, the three new pulse species are half or less of the statewide means, except that the walleye mercury was a little bit higher than the state mean. And for DDT and DDT and Chlordane, all three species were higher in 2017 than the statewide mean, not by a lot. And again, this is a really rough comparison. It's just averaging everything across the state. It's not taking into account, for instance, size differences. So I'll finish by talking briefly about who does what in New York. The Department of Environmental Conservation collects and analyzes fish, and we evaluate the analytical quality, and then we distribute the data. And the Department of Health evaluates the results and issues fish consumption advisories when appropriate. And with that, if there's questions, I will stop sharing my screen and show myself. And do we have questions?
So if anyone has questions for Wayne, hi everyone, Emily Vale from the Hudson River Watershed Alliance. I'm helping out the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance by moderating some of the Q&A this evening. So if anyone has questions based on Wayne's presentation, please be sure to drop them in the Q&A box, and that is at the bottom of your screen. We'll give folks 1 minute. And we'll have more time after Audrey's presentation as well, if other questions come up. All right, well, hearing none, Wayne, thank you so much for your talk. Really important and interesting stuff, and we'll pass it on to Audrey.
Oh, hey everyone.
We have a question. Sorry, I knew if I talked long enough, we'd get one. So Wayne, can you come back on? Okay, great. We have a thank you for your great presentation, and I absolutely agree. So we have a question here. The Wallkill was identified as a source of DDT to the Hudson River and New York Harbor in the past. How elevated are the fish DDT numbers?
So they're roughly double, well, they're about 1/10 of a part per million higher, which is not a lot. They're a factor of 2 or so higher than the statewide average. So I would say there's definitely some elevation, but not a lot. And we certainly do see DDT concentrations like that around the state. I mean, usually we don't see DDT or very, very low concentrations. So there are places where there's been historical release, contamination, and we see it. They're DDT, like the PCBs and the Chlordanes, they're referred to as persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. So it doesn't really break down very readily. We do tend to see concentrations declining over time, but it tends to be pretty slow.
Great, thank you. And then we have another question on PFAS chemicals. You mentioned that PFAS analytics are done by an outside lab, and is any of that data available on fish?
Yeah, we definitely have PFAS in fish, but not for the Wallkill River. We're actually started doing that at our own laboratory, and so we're starting to build that into our routine monitoring, but we're also tending to focus on locations that are possible release sites like firefighting training sites or other industrial sites like downstream of airports. So that's really our focus there. And also some toxicological studies. So we're not able to sample as broadly yet for PFAS as we can for the other contaminants that we're doing at the lab. We're still kind of ramping that up, and going out to the contract laboratories was pretty expensive, so we're limited in what we could do there.
Great, thank you. How can the Wallkill River Watershed Alliance advocate for reduction in some of these contaminants?
I don't have an answer to that. I really don't have a good way to answer that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I see one more question here, and then we'll move on to Audrey's talk. Is the impoundment of water by dams a significant factor in mercury levels?
As a general rule, yes. I mean, nationwide, we tend to see higher mercury concentrations in impoundments, and that probably has to do with the fact that water elevations fluctuate, and so you have wetting, and then you have the chance for conditions to go oxygen deprived, which allows mercury to be converted to methyl mercury, which is what tends to accumulate in fish. And we do tend to see some of our higher concentrations in New York in reservoirs, but there are also sort of physiographic factors that also influence mercury concentrations, like the Adirondacks, and to some extent the Catskills tend to have higher mercury in the fish.
Great, thank you so much. So our next talk will continue this important conversation, and we'll have more time for Q&A after Audrey presents as well.
Getting my presentation up. All right. See if it goes full screen. There we go. So I'm Audrey Van Gnechten. I work for New York State Department of Health. And I am not a toxicologist, but if you have toxicology specific questions, I will take note of them, and I'm happy to bring them back to our section that does deal and set fish advisories. My role for the past 10 or so years has been working on the Hudson River Fish Advisory Outreach Project. So I do a lot of outreach for both the Hudson River and other places around the state, and generally am happy to answer anybody's questions about our fish advisories. So quickly, I'm gonna go over how do we set fish advice at New York State Department of Health. You heard some about this, obviously, from Wayne. What chemicals are a concern in the Wallkill? What does that data show in regards to how we set advisories, what our thresholds are, and what is the advice on eating fish from the Wallkill? And really fast, just a little bit of background. So DOH has been issuing advice on eating fish that you catch for essentially more than 40 years. The science is constantly evolving, and our folks in our toxicology program make sure that they're up on the science as it is evolving. And so levels do change over the years, and when that happens, oftentimes we will look back, we'll revise as new data comes in on fish species. We work very closely with DEC, as Wayne mentioned. Division of Fish and Wildlife does all the collection and the analysis, and then they provide us the data. And DOH also is able to provide some input. So if we hear of people that have a concern about fish, or they might know of a historical source, and we know that a lot of people are fishing in a certain location, we can ask DEC, and sometimes they're able to accommodate our requests. We also work closely with regional DEC staff on both technical and outreach issues. So it's usually a very collaborative process. So just a little bit about the features of the DOH fish advisories. So it's very much a risk management approach. The advice is typically protective of higher risk groups, which are women essentially of childbearing age, which we classify as under 50, and children under 15. That's because most of these chemicals have neurodevelopment issues for children, especially. Children are just more susceptible to these chemicals, and women who become pregnant can pass them to their children. And oftentimes the half-life, how long chemicals stay in the body, is actually very, very long. So women and children are a major factor in the stricter advisories. Our advisories are species specific, and they take into consideration the fat or lipid content in the fish, and also their food chain position, especially with chemicals like mercury. Our advice typically has 4 or 3 different categories. So the least restrictive is 4 meals per month for everyone. And then the next category is 1 meal per month. And then it goes all the way down to a recommendation not to eat, and essentially just to do catch and release fishing. There are also, especially for places that have a mercury issue, there's fish length specific advisories. This is because oftentimes older, larger fish will have higher levels of mercury. And some chemicals are, they have a very nice linear line where you can make a cut point, and you can really see that above this length, it's going to be an issue. And so you'll see if you go to our website, or if you are a fisher person yourself, oftentimes like in the Adirondacks, there'll be cut points for length. And largely the advice on eating fish you catch depends upon who you are, where you fish, and what you catch. So we set our advisories. Hold on, I have to like move my little window here. There we go. Okay. So we look at FDA standards, other guidelines where applicable, take into consideration, EPA guidance. We have DOH advisory guidelines for a good number of the main chemicals that are currently known and found in New York State. Our toxicologists do exposure and risk assessments. And then we do a lot of, we check the data. We make sure that it's representative, that it's a strong number of fish. And we think about the potential health risks while also trying to balance the benefits of fish consumption and also just getting out and fishing, period. There's cultural implications to that, as well as health implications. So it's not, we don't just set a guideline and then that's the only thing that the health advice is based on. It also takes into account several other factors. And this is what we call the risk management approach. As I mentioned before, there's special considerations, especially for the high risk groups. And I would want, I can put this website in the chat after I'm done speaking, because Wayne mentioned Pcbs and Chlordane, which we do have guidelines for, but I didn't include them in this because they weren't really like, they're so low actually that I didn't even think to include them. But that website goes into much greater detail about all the guidelines and the approach. It's a little bit more technical. So feel free to check that out. And it actually has just been updated with our new PCB protocol for certain waters. Okay, so for mercury. So essentially, if fish levels are overall less than 1 part per million, it's going to be the general advisory, which is 4 meals a month for both the special population, the women and the children, and for women over 50 and men over 15. Once you start getting into the 1 ppm to 2 ppm, range, we start to restrict fish consumption a bit. So it goes to a don't eat to be extra protective for the women and the children. And it goes to 1 meal a month for women over 50 and men over 15. Over 2 ppm, we start to recommend that folks don't eat it. For DDT, it's actually up to 5 parts per million. So anything under that is, overall, most of the fish are looking like they're less than 5 parts per million. It's going to be the general advisory for everyone. Then between 5 and 15 is the next cut point, in addition to all those other risk management factors. And then over 15 parts per million is the don't eat category. So mercury in fish. So it's a widespread issue nationally and globally. And New York is, obviously we have some issues in our reservoirs, which doesn't really affect the drinking water, but they're bioaccumulators. So the fish will have many thousands times the level that is often found in the water. It comes from man-made and natural sources. Nationally, fuel combustion and waste incineration are the major sources. And the organic form, the methylmercury, as Wayne referred to, builds up in fish and mammals, and it bioaccumulates up the food chain. And the higher the placement in the food chain, typically the higher mercury levels. So for the levels in the Wallkill fish from the 2017 collection, essentially all the fish other than the walleye were really quite low. And just going back real fast to the little chart. So anything less than 1 ppm is really, you're still well in 4 meal a month territory for everybody. So some walleye had mercury levels that suggest the need that, in the future, we could do another collection, especially of the larger fish. I think Wayne can touch on this a little bit after I'm done. It's a trend, and walleye tend to be really a problem as they get older. They're voracious predators from a very young age, and they live a long time. So they have a tendency to be accumulators once they get into that older range. And I am not a fish biologist, so I won't talk about fish age classes, et cetera, et cetera. I will leave that to Wayne. But that is an interesting discussion that I think DEC and DOH will be having in the next few years. So for now, advice remains 4 meals per month for everyone in regards to the mercury. In general, for mercury, the best practice is to avoid predator fish or limit how many of these fish that you're eating, and choose fish that are lower in mercury. And mercury is found really throughout the flesh of the fish, so you can't really do any cooking or trimming practices that will help you reduce the mercury in an actual fish fillet. You just have to choose either a fish that's just generally has less mercury, or you have to choose a fish that's smaller within legal limits, a younger, smaller fish. So things like bass, walleye, northern pike, larger perch, pickerel, those are all, you'll often find mercury levels in those that make them so that we have some sort of a specific advisory, especially for women and kids. Oops, let me go back one more. On the other hand, these other fish, trout tend to be a very good choice in most waters. Panfish, rock bass, bullhead, and smaller perch. Those are all tend to be lower in mercury. DDT in the Wallkill River. So it's not actually from a known point source, as far as I could tell. I tried to work with our Bureau of Environmental Exposure Investigation a little bit to see if there was like a specific site that really contributed to this. And it doesn't seem to be, as far as I could tell. It was used extensively in agriculture, and obviously the Wallkill River runs right through amazing, agricultural lands. The production peaked in the US in 1963, and it was banned in 1972. And DDT and its breakdown products are persistent in soils and sediments, and being in aquatic environments makes them stick around essentially even longer. They take even longer to break down. For the fish levels, again, anything, for our threshold, really where we start thinking about implementing an advisory, it's 5 parts per million. So you can see that the averages are well below that, really not even close. So that's great news, because even though, DDT is present, and even though, it was reported that it was a contributor to the Hudson River, the levels really are still relatively low. The catfish had the highest level, like Wayne mentioned, and this is a high fat species, and it's common for these lipophilic or fat-loving pesticides to accumulate in fish like catfish. Because the levels are still relatively low, especially compared to the bottom threshold, the advice also still remains 4 meals a month for everyone. So even though the Wallkill may look kind of turbid and muddy, it's one of our better waters in New York State. It's a 4 meal per month water. And one thing for people that are fishing in the Wallkill River that they can do, and this is good advice for really any river, any water body in New York that is near any sort of city, town, because we do have a little bit of stuff everywhere in New York. If you trim and skin, and sorry, this graphic looks like it's having some issues with its arrows. If you trim and skin the fish, so take out the skin, cut away the dark fatty meat, and you cook it in a way so that the fat drips off, it can really reduce these these lipophilic chemicals by quite a bit. For PCBs, it can be almost as much as half if you trim and skin and you cook it so the fat drips off. And this applies to all those chemicals: PCBs, dioxin, murex, DDT, chlordane, dieldrin. And another tip is to try to avoid or limit how much of the really fatty fish that you're eating. So things like catfish, carp, and white perch tend to be quite fatty fish. So that's it on my part. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I will leave that up for a second if anyone wants to write down information, and then I will add that website to the chat and I will stop sharing.
Great. Thanks so much, Audrey. Okay. A question and comment just came in. So the carp study that identified DDT in the Wallkill River several years ago traced the source of the DDT to the Black Dirt region between the Pine Island and Pellets Island Bridge. The source was considered fresh relative to the date that DDT was banned. Did your sources in the Environmental Investigations Unit discuss this? And do the more recent fish data tell us anything about the potential for an ongoing or persistent source of DDT?
My folks did not point that out. I can go back to them and ask them again. Can you put that specific location in the chat for me, and I'll take a note of it. Who asked that question?
That was Dan Shapley from Riverkeeper.
Hi, Dan.
But I know many of us are familiar with that study, so I had that question as well if Dan didn't ask it.
Yeah. They, I asked them. They did not find anything. Tried to look, and I remember I read the carp study, but I will try to. I can try to dig a little bit deeper into that, and we can see it. Wayne, I don't know if you want to add anything about the kind of like the freshness of the DDT or whatever, based on analytes that you found. That is not my wheelhouse. I'm more on the PCB side of things. But you can go ahead and comment on that if you.
Yeah, I guess I'll say I don't really know. I'll just say I don't know. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. And Wayne, while you're here, we have a question that came in late from your talk, although I think actually this might be for both of you. Does the Department of Health have guidance values or other criteria to use to evaluate PFAS chemicals in fish? What amount triggers a fish advisory, such as those that are in place near Newburgh and Hoosick Falls? And is there any ambient level of PFAS that would trigger that kind of assessment in those fish?
So yeah, do you want me to answer that, Audrey, or do you want to?
Yeah, you can go ahead and start. I'll pull up our website too that shows the new PFAS levels.
Yeah, so the health department, in fact, does have guidance values, and New York participates with the Great Lakes Consortium for Fish Consumption Advisories, which is other Great Lakes states and Ontario. And so New York was actually a leader in developing PFAS best practice, which is what these numbers that Audrey is showing come from. And so these are the current guideline values. These were developed after we did the collection and analysis at Newburgh and Hoosick Falls. But I can tell you that for the most part, the concentrations were well above the 200 parts per billion limit for a don't eat advisory.
And I'll also add that the for Hoosick Falls too, there was, I believe, some PFAS, correct, Wayne? But mostly it was PFOA, which doesn't quite build up in fish the same way as the PFOS does.
Yeah, Hoosick Falls Petersburg is a PFOA site, and in fact, the only place there's an advisory in that area is Thayer's Pond, which gets the leachate from the Hoosick Falls landfill and had really high water concentrations of lots of different PFAS. So, but the collections that we had from the Hoosick River in a couple of sites near Hoosick Falls and the Little Hoosick River near Petersburg, and also a tributary that drained the Petersburg landfill, the concentrations were well below that 50 part per billion, I guess, guideline value to go to a 1 meal per month advisory.
Great, thank you. And thanks for sharing your screen to show us right at the source where we can find that information. That's really helpful.
The shortcut is in the chat. This is like the long, path. There's a shorter one.
Perfect. Parts of the Wallkill River watershed in New Jersey are impaired under the Clean Water Act for arsenic. Is arsenic a contaminant that affects fish or triggers advisories? Knowing that the DEC's labs don't include heavy metals quite yet, but would that be something that would be studied in the future?
So yeah, we haven't analyzed arsenic. I believe that's one of the metals that this analyzer can do. Because you have to tune the device that we got. Our thinking on putting this into practice, into service, would be that we would analyze specific metals if we had a specific reason to. And we don't tend to see a lot of advisories based on arsenic. And that's talking with folks from the Great Lakes states that I work with also.
Yeah, if we see anything, it's usually cadmium in like crabs, essentially. And some shellfish can have issues, but I don't think anyone's eating Hudson River shellfish or Wallkill River mussels.
Well, we've gotten through all of our questions, so I'll just give a call if anyone else has any questions. Oh, great, there's one just came in. Are there any emerging contaminants or pollutants of concern that are being studied as bioaccumulating in fish?
So we are looking at a few other contaminants, mostly in the Great Lakes, because we can actually get US EPA funding to look at those. So those include polychlorinated naphthalenes and chlorinated paraffins. So we've been able to do a little bit of looking at those, and also hexabromocyclododecanes. We did a real early screening study in the Great Lakes around 2010 for some of those, and I'm hopeful that we'll get some more EPA funding to do some more of that in Lake Erie. Those analyses have to go to contract labs, and they're really expensive. So we're pretty limited in what we can do on that.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Kyle, Wayne, or Audrey? Are there any studies about body contact with Wallkill River water, given some of the concerns about the fish?
You mean like for people swimming? You know, that would be a much better question to ask the folks from Division of Water tomorrow, because they deal with that.
Yeah, from typically what we tell people who are asking that question for swimming in Hudson River, which has like much higher PCB levels than the Wallkill, is that the chemicals usually are not a problem for swimming. Of course, Department of Health is always going to recommend that you swim in a regulated bathing beach, because you know those beaches are regularly tested. But typically the problem that crops up you know, is more related to like sewage and bacteria, more so than those types of chemicals. And like Wayne said, feel free to punt that one to Division of Water folks as well.
That's great. I think we'll make sure to do that. Have there been any studies looking at microplastics in fish in New York State? We
in DEC have not done that. There are some studies, and my impression about microplastic studies is every place you look for them, you're going to find them. And it's hard to know what any particular finding means. I went to the Society for Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry meeting a couple of years ago, and there were dozens and dozens of posters, you know, reporting findings of microplastics and all kinds of organisms. But I'm not a toxicologist, this is not my area of expertise, but I haven't seen a lot saying like, what does this mean?
Yeah, and I would say DOH is in the same boat. We know that it's, you know, it's an issue all over the place at this point, but how to interpret those results, I don't think that our folks have come down on one way or another yet either. The science is still out.
Great, thank you. Well, that's all we have for questions, so I'll hand it back over to Kyle to close the evening.
I just wanted to say thank you again to our presenters. That was really informative, and thank you all for attending tonight. And we'll see you tomorrow evening for another great presentation. Thanks, y'all. Have a good night.